Hi there. Welcome to Infinite Stories. This is the podcast where we sit down and interview everyday people just like you and me. This is your host, Mitchell Vine, and boy, do we have an incredible story for you. Let's jump into this week's interview.
Sweet. Okay, well, let's go with the easiest question first. What's your name?
Well, my American name is Jacob Yaley. If you want to be technical, my Korean name is Kim Nam Soo. So
Okay,
yeah.
and how would you like me to address you on the podcast today?
You can address me by Jacob.
Okay, sounds good. I don't think I've ever called you by the other name that I can recall. I know
Not
we've
many
had that
people have.
conversation before. Do you wish that people did like it all, like secretly, just like,
no.
okay.
I'm good with Jacob. I'm more of a
Okay.
supplanter and a deceiver than a Kim Nam Soo. So
Good. Well, we'll get back to that.
okay.
So, kind of going off of what you've already alluded to, but where are you from originally, and what did life kind of look like for you just growing up, childhood?
Yeah. I'm. If you can't tell by my voice, I'm adopted. I'm from South Korea. Um, I was adopted when I was really young, before a year old, I believe. It's timeline's kind of fuzzy on that part, but um, yeah, I don't know much about my birth parents other than they were very young, and my dad was in the army. But in South Korea, everybody has to do mandatory military time, so that's not incredibly uncommon. But anyways, my parents, my mom and my dad here in America, they weren't able to have children of their own, so they ended up applying for all these, uh, adoption agencies, and finally they were able to adopt me. And funny story, they were actually when they got the news that they found a kid for them, they were actually watching the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments. So that's what they were watching. So I don't know, maybe it was a sign, but
A sign of what? Now I'm curious.
I don't know. A sign from God that I was on my way.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but anyways, yeah. I just a little fun fact there.
That's sweet. So,
Yeah.
as you kind of grew up in the American culture, what was it like for you just being a kid?
Um I so I I think really it started to click that I was adopted when I was in kindergarten. And actually probably even a little earlier than that, more like preschool. It really didn't bother me. I know some kids it would probably bother them, but when you're in kindergarten and preschool, I think it kind of goes over your head a little bit and you don't really think about it. I do remember the time that I did ask my parents like why I looked different than them, and I was fairly young, so you really want to think of a preschooler, being able to put two and two together that hey, I don't look like my parents, but
Hmm.
I just remember for some reason I was able to, and I think it was actually because of an outside influence. Like people were telling me, I remember in preschool, not adults but other kids, like I don't look like my family. So I remember asking them like why my eyes look different, why I look different than them, and I just remember them saying that I was adopted. And I just, at the time as a kid, you're just like, well, oh, okay, I guess
Hmm.
it is what it is. You know what I mean? You don't really think much about it. So that's kind of when I first like realized that something was a little bit different. And I think for some people it really bothers them. Growing up, it really didn't bother me. I think there was maybe a phase in junior high where it was kind of different, where I was like a little bit, junior high you kind of go through those insecurity years where you're feeling really insecure, and I just remember thinking that I wish I looked different. I wish I was more American, I guess. Um, but then you kind of hit the high school years, and it's a little different because everybody's trying to look for something that sets them apart and makes them unique. And in the high school years, I already had a built-in uh, something that made me unique, without even like by my effort, by me doing anything that automatically made me different than everybody else. So I think in high school I kind of learned to embrace it, and the people closest to me and my coworkers and family members, they all know that, like, I'm not afraid to crack Asian jokes. So it's not something that, like, I walk on eggshells about. I know that I'm Asian. Everybody knows that I'm Asian. I just kind of embrace it. So I think I started doing that more in high school, and
Mm.
just kind of learning that it was in a lot of ways it is a gift. Like, everybody's trying to be unique in high school, and I, I was able to have that just by being born. So,
Mm.
um, but yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. So, kind of staying in the part of your story of just kind of near the beginning, can you recall like one of the first times that you might have encountered sin for the first time? Do you have any memories of like your first understanding of what sin is?
Yeah. So, like a lot of people I think that you've had on your podcast, I grew up in the church. Um, and so I remember, you hear that word all through your elementary years and your younger years, but I think it starts to really become real when you hit the junior high years. And I'd say that's when I really started struggling. Especially, you go to public school, you're just exposed to everything, and especially in junior high. And I just remember being exposed to some things in school that, like, you normally I normally like wouldn't have been exposed to. Um, and so, yeah, it was just, I remember, I think more vividly in junior high. I think I got baptized when I was in sixth grade. So junior high was kind of the time where, and it was kind of a weird time too, because I'd just been baptized, but also, like, the closer you get to the light, the more darkness you see in yourself. And I think that's when my faith started to become my own, was in junior high, for
Mm.
sure. But I also, you start realizing, oh wow, there's a lot of sin, especially looking back at it too. You just, there were sinful times, but yeah, definitely junior high, a little bit in high school. Um, I shouldn't say a little bit,
Just like
but
this much.
yeah, but and it was always kind of a confusing thing for me, because, like, when I was saved was in sixth grade, and in the grand scheme of things for a sixth grader, there's not a lot to be like repentant for in the grand
Mm.
scheme of things. So when I got into junior high and high school and I got exposed to all this sin, it was kind of a confusing time, because it was like I've just been, baptized, my faith is my own, and you think like it's this, we talk about progressive sanctification, where it's just this line where you think you're just constantly supposed to be improving in a constant and steady pattern. But for me, it was like I'm saved, and then I jump into all of this junk and all of this sin, and it's like you start to question a lot of things, like, was I really
Mm.
saved? Am I really saved? And so that kind of happened in junior high and high school. So, um, but yeah, sin. Going back to your original question with the sin, junior high for sure was kind of when I really started. Uh,
Mm.
not necessarily that sin wasn't there, but I think that's kind of when you start noticing it, when you start realizing what sin is. So
Yeah, like that true acknowledgement of like, I know what it is. Like
yeah,
I could have denied it. I could have been had that ignorance or that innocence up to a certain point, but as soon as you have that
yeah,
understanding, it's like I can't look at it any other way. No,
yeah.
that's really good. So kind of looking back a little bit more, do you have any teachers or mentors or guides that kind of like guided you through salvation, but also just your faith in general, questions you had?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like, like, my parents were a huge influence, obviously, but there were some things too. And not saying like nothing. This isn't. I think God gave me the perfect parents for me. They fitted my needs in a way that only
Mm.
God could provide. But obviously, parents are humans too, and they're not perfect. My parents got me through a lot of stuff, but there are some things like that I wish they would have touched base on, that a lot of parents don't touch base, especially in the sin aspect when it comes to things like, sexual sin and stuff like that.
Mm.
We kind of use that as an off-topic subject in the house when really it needs to be talked about. But
Mm.
anyways, um, Yeah, I would say like a lot of people in the church, indirectly too, in a lot of ways. I was really, especially when I was younger in the church, I was more of the quiet, shy, not very outgoing. But at the time at NLCC, my junior high, well, the youth pastor there at the time, really, he was the one who kind of not necessarily got the ball rolling, but when I really started thinking about things. Um, and then after that, um, there was another guy from our church who did Sunday school, and his name was Randy, and he so during Sunday school, like, and this was for junior high and high school kids, I remember at the time thinking like, oh man, it's Randy, like he prints out all these worksheets for us, like this is just like schoolwork, this kind of sucks. But like looking back at it, it's like what I got from that and what I learned from that, I'm very thankful for, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. And so I
Mm,
think I think he was another big influence, and just even the people Rod and Nate at church at NLCC, and then just a lot of close family friends from NLCC. Like I said, I grew up in the church, so just watching people, um, and then seeing my mom. My mom was a great server. She was always helping out and always serving in the church. So I really got a good example through her of what service was in terms of through the church. And it really didn't become my own until later in life because like I said, at that point I was really shy and it was kind of like I was not necessarily hiding my faith, but it wasn't something that I would go out and proclaim, on the
mm.
hilltops or the mountains. So but I would say, yeah, like my youth pastor during junior high, and then also he's kind of the one too who kind of influenced me and helped me make that decision of, okay, I'm going to go get baptized. But also, growing up as an only child too, I'd say my parents had a really big influence on that too. Just because, growing up as an only child, and not only that, but not living in town, living in the country, it's just me and my mom and my dad. So that's who I have. And as a kid, back then, we didn't have cell phones, when I was in elementary and even junior high. I was just stuck with them. So, so yeah, I'd say a lot of my influence came from them for sure.
Good, good. How about as you were growing up, childhood, middle school, high school, and even to where you are right now, were
Uh-huh.
there any lies that you remember believing about yourself, or just any lies just in general that you remember hearing that you still wrestle
Mm.
with?
Uh, for me, I think it was more of an internal thing. I think it's just more internalized, the enemy. Uh, I can't really think of much like during growing up, like junior high and high school. To be completely honest with you, the ones that I can think of have more. And I know, you and I being friends, you kind of experienced my battle and how I went through some of that stuff here just in the last couple of years, really. Um, I'd say my faith is just uh, it's really grown in these last couple of years. I was going through a lot of like uh, battles in terms of assurance of salvation, and I think it's a lot of lies in terms of uh, you think that church kids sometimes have it easy, but I think that church kids, and I can't speak for, the people who didn't grow up in the church. Obviously, I grew up in the church, but from what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I've experienced myself, it seems like a lot of times church kids actually have the tougher experience with their faith. Um, they go through completely different battles, and a lot of times they're not addressed as much in our church culture um, when they need to be. But I just remember like a lot of lies in terms of just who I am in Jesus Christ. Um, and for me, like just coming through it, I believe, for the Christian, a lot of times the hardest battle isn't against sin. The hardest battle is believing what God has declared them to be. And that's where my battle was. I heard all these lies like, you have to do something to contribute to your salvation, or you have to like expose yourself almost, like shame yourself. and make this huge sacrifice to prove that God is, that you love God. Um, I know, like, to use a big word, I'd say asceticism, which, means like, kind of whipping yourself almost. Like, you have to suffer, like, make yourself suffer. Um, and life has to be basically miserable in order to be saved, kind of thing, if that makes sense. I remember one summer, like, the biggest lie, I think I remember waking up. And this was just, a few years ago. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, just sweat pouring down, and this burning sensation in my chest, thinking that I had literally been condemned to hell, and there was nothing that I could do about it. And, I had this really big spiral because, I mean, as you can imagine, uh, especially as a Christian, like, we have this joy and this hope. Imagine that being taken away, or at least not necessarily taken away, but you blinded from it. And living your life thinking that you are condemned to hell and there's nothing that you can do to reverse that. Like,
Mm.
it's a wild lie, and it like it really did a number on me. It was the toughest spiritual battle, and I still suffer from times of, I still struggle. I still struggle, which isn't a bad thing. But, there are times where that sometimes flares up. But those are like some of the big lies. I think, and it all stems from one main one, and then that's you're not good enough or you're
Mm.
not doing enough. I think even in like more personal battles, I think that's the big lie that I probably struggle with the most in my life.
Mm. Well, you're not alone. I guarantee you that. With as many times as I've asked that question on the podcast, that's definitely at the top of the list that
Yeah,
everybody definitely wrestles through at some point. If they haven't already, they will soon. I can
yeah,
almost guarantee it. And if they
yeah,
can't, I mean, praise God, that's awesome. But also just to have that acknowledgement of that being a primary arrow that the enemy has in their arsenal, like that
yeah,
that is that's the norm, that's for sure.
yeah,
um
yeah.
that's good. So then what is the truth to counteract those lies
Yeah, well, so I kind of going back to before, answering that question, like just answering, kind of building up to that. I think for a Christian, um, like I kind of said earlier, the biggest battle for a Christian is believing who God has declared them to be. So I don't like to think like the enemy, but like if you really think about the enemy's tactics, for a Christian, what is he going to try and do? What is he going to attack you with? He's going to try and convince you that what God has said about you isn't true, or that God is deceiving you, or that God is not telling you the truth in this matter. Um,
then?
Kind of like we look at the original sin with Adam and Eve. What did the serpent do? He was subtle, and he used he basically convinced Eve that um, God wasn't telling her the truth, wasn't giving her the whole story. And that's kind of what I felt like, at the time. Like, I read some Bible verses out of context. The Bible can be, if you don't read it properly, it can be a kind of a scary book, if you're if you're not
Terrifying.
wearing it with the gospel lens. And I was not reading it with the gospel lens, so there are some verses in there that I took out of context, and I thought, wow, I'm struggling with sin right now. I'm wrestling with sin, like, uh, and I thought like I was condemned, and that, um, but anyways, one of the truths, going back to your question, like with the truth that I lean on is I I really have to just, on the counter side of that, where the Bible can be a scary place, it can also be the safest, most beautiful place,
Mm.
that you can go, and that's where I had to go. When the lies came in, I had to go to what does God say? What does God declare? Just to give you an example, um, in Isaiah, it's amazing. He says that as God has sworn to our forefathers from the days of old, that He would not flood the earth. Um, so He has sworn that He will not be angry with us, that He will
Mm,
not rebuke us, and that His steadfast love will not depart from us. So
mm,
just dissecting that and taking that verse and listening to the voices that are in my head, I'm very analytical. So I took that verse and I'm like, okay, well, first off, this voice in my head is angry. And what does God say? What does God say? He promises, and He's saying this promise is like the promise that He promised not to flood the earth. How many of us wake up in the morning and say, "Oh God, thank you for not flooding the world"? No, we just take that promise for granted. And
mm,
that's what the kind of faith we have faith in that promise. This is what God is saying. God is saying He basically wants us to have that amount of faith in what He's saying after that, in this promise. But anyways, like I had to use that verse and kind of like Paul says, in Ephesians about the sword of the word. I had to use it not to be on the defensive anymore. I had to be on the attack. Um, this voice was angry inside my head. He was threatening me. He was rebuking me. He's threatening to take away his love. He's threatening to take away salvation if I don't do certain things. And so the lie is there. He's trying to go against what God said. I just had to take those words, God promises, and talk to myself. That's the renewal of the mind, I believe. I had to say,
mm,
no, God says that He promises not to be angry with me, not to rebuke me, and that His love will never depart from me. And that's the funny thing, too. If we had to earn God's love, then it wouldn't be steadfast love. That's literally
mhm,
the and when you really think about that, how many times is the word steadfast love used in the Bible? If we have to earn God's love, or if we have to do something to receive God's love, then it no longer is steadfast love, because there's a requirement to it. And
mm,
so just things like that, I think really these last couple of years, like if my life had a big calling card to it. My biggest conviction is, and my girlfriend Michelle, she'll tell you the same thing, because I always, like, whenever we go to church and we're listening to the sermon, like sometimes, like, not to be judgmental against other sermons, but like I have just this conviction about the modern church and legalism, how legalism has crept into our modern church. But if I would have to say, like, I feel like my big conviction is in today's world, in the modern church, we make grace as a pillar of our faith, just a pillar. Um, and we think our foundation has to have this pillar of grace, this pillar of faith, this pillar of works, and this pillar of righteousness. And we have to
mm,
accomplish all of those, and that makes up the foundation of our faith. But that isn't true. Paul makes it clearer, and so do the apostles, that the foundation, the whole foundation that we build upon is grace. And that's kind of like been my big thing these last couple of years. We can't let anything else, we can't let grace become just merely a pillar. It has to be the whole foundation.
mm,
Otherwise, we're going to be, people are going to experience what I experienced. Just, uh, you know, a wave blown and tossed to and fro, like not having any kind of security at all and being completely insecure, not having any
mm,
peace. And then also just I got really confused, I remember, in the word too, because it's like we think that we have to, um, the Christian life has to be almost unbearable for us. Otherwise we're not living it out correctly. But how
mm,
many times does God talk about love, joy, peace, rest? I think of the Psalm, David's Psalm. He says, um, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want." I like. The better English translation I believe is, "I lack nothing." And that's a little different than I shall not want. When he says I lack nothing, it means that everything has already been given to you. So that's a
Hmm.
little bit different. But anyways, yeah. If going back to your question, the biggest thing I would say is just you have to use the Word of God. You can't use your feelings to dissect you can't use your feelings to dissect what's going on. You can't use your own thinking, and you can't even use it also says who can understand who can understand God, who can understand His ways. Do not lean on your own understanding.
Hmm.
And if you try and lean on your own understanding, you're going to be even more confused. You just have to trust in what God is saying in His Word and what Jesus says in His Word. And that's kind of what I had to do every day. I had like my verses, my sword that I would go to counter those specific lies. The book of Romans, is one of my favorite books. It's filled with truths of who you are in Jesus Christ and the completed work of what Jesus Christ has done for you. It's not me
Mm.
plus God. It's not me plus Jesus. It's Christ alone. Um, we say that, but do we really trust that? And do we really believe that? No church is going to say they're legalistic, um, but we have to look at
They
what we're.
might.
Some might.
Sometimes
Uh,
they enjoy that.
yeah, yeah. But like I said, just really being real with God's word and taking it for what it says too.
Mm.
I'm not trying to. It's easy to twist our modern theology with that, and I got sucked up into that for a while. You know that. Just it became all about doctrine and theology, where we should be focused on grace. That's what it's all about.
Mm.
Some people might call this, what I'm all about. They might call it hyper grace, but I, I, in
It, yeah.
yeah, in, but the funny thing is in Romans when Paul says where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. The Greek word that he uses for abound is actually where we get our English word hyper from.
Mm.
So yeah, it is hyper grace. Paul was even, it's in there. It's hyper grace, and I
Hmm.
think that should always be the core. That is the gospel. So,
Yeah, it
um,
is a gospel of grace.
yeah,
Nothing about this is possible without grace. So when people are like, you're
yeah,
using too much grace in the equation, you're like, no, we don't have enough.
yeah. Well,
If we believed
uh,
the amount that it was,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's so easy to think in our lives too. A little bit of grace and a little bit of human effort, and I think that's where the modern church gets caught up in sometimes. And it's not that. It's all grace, 100%. Not even 5% human effort, not even 5%
Mm.
me. When we think that, we're not we're declaring that Christ's sufficiency is not enough.
Mm.
And we know that He's dealt with sin, past, present, and future, now and forever. And how do we, how do we look at ourselves now because of that? Are we looking at ourselves actually through those lens?
Mm.
Or are we still carrying around guilt and shame from our past? Paul says in uh, Paul says in Corinthians, we now regard nobody according to the flesh. What does that mean? That means we don't look at people based off of their human effort, their righteousness, their human righteousness, or even by their past or worse mistakes or their past sins. We don't
Mm.
regard them according to that. That's what grace does. That's what grace means. And it's in my life, to make it a practical in my life, it's made it a lot easier for me to forgive. Um, people don't even have, just especially the brothers and the sisters. I know like God's grace has already reconciled them to me. And just it allows me just to be more forgiving and just understanding too, where people are coming from, what they might be struggling with, and so that also helps you to love people, I think, a little bit more too.
Mm. It's interesting. We're talking so much about the gospel right now, and it's funny how it's slowly transitioned into that, and like we weren't even trying. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
it's very natural with practice and with the Holy Spirit just guiding the conversation in such a way
yeah,
that the gospel needs to be brought up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and going like you make a great example there because people think like, and I used to think like this too. I struggled with it. This is one of the things when you read all about this in the New Testament about walking in the Spirit, and I used to think what walking in the Spirit meant was, we see in that verse the flip side of it, you will not
Mm,
gratify the desires of the flesh. And what we think is walking in the Spirit is me by my human effort not giving into temptation, not giving it into sin. But
mm,
if you really dissect that verse and look at it, Paul's not saying that that's what walking in the Spirit is. He says that's the result of walking in the Spirit. And so when I switched my mindset from that and just focused on what is walking in the Spirit, well, walking in the Spirit is walking in what God has declared me to be. Um, that I'm forgiven, that I'm
mm,
loved, that I'm completely innocent of all of my past, that nobody can accuse me, nobody can condemn me. Then I did start to see this decline in sin in my life. And so I think a lot of people think that walking in the Spirit is this like real big discipline of me disciplining myself and just making sure that, I'm doing everything that I can to avoid sin. No, that's the end result of walking in the Spirit. That's not walking in the Spirit itself.
mm.
That's the fruit of walking in the Spirit. And so when we're walking in who we are in Christ, because we've been given a spirit that's incorruptible, Peter says that, um, means our spirit, the spirit that we have through Christ is perfect. Um,
Mm,
we don't we're sinless in that regard. I'm not saying we're sinless in our flesh, but
mm,
and that's what God is telling us, that's what Paul is telling us to look at. We have to look at people through the lens of who they are in Jesus Christ. That's how God looks at them, and that's how we need to look at them too.
mm. A lot of people who call themselves Christians, they typically refer to a moment like a salvation moment, or like the aha
Huh.
moment. Is that something that
It,
you think is helpful? Like, is that the case for everybody?
um, I think it's dependent. One thing I've learned through these last few years is that question there. I used to wrestle with it, and I think it's just dependent on the person. God, everybody's story is unique in Christ, right? Like
Mm, amen.
we all have the same backstory, but God has also given us, unique gifts and unique stories. I'd say for a lot of people who grew up in the church, I would say they probably would have a similar answer to mine, and that is I wouldn't necessarily say I had one moment of like the light shining down and God descending from the Spirit descending like a dove from the clouds. But a series of moments like that. I can't really point to one specific moment where I was like, oh, that's it. But a lot of like maybe smaller moments of like my faith slowly becoming my own.
Mm,
And I think sometimes kids who grow up in the church, they freak out when they get older. And I did this because they're like, oh man, like I don't have this one moment in my life where I can say, the lights came on and like I could feel like I could literally, feel this spirit enter me kind of thing. They don't
mm,
have a moment like that, so they're like, "Oh crap, am I even saved?" You know what I mean?
mm,
And I guess what my goal is to say to those people, the church people, is that's okay. God works differently in everybody's life. Just because you can't point necessarily to the moment, like the exact moment maybe that it happened, doesn't mean you're not saved now. And
mm,
and I think it's easier for people who grew up outside the church because they're like they have no knowledge of the church. They have no knowledge of Christ. They have no knowledge of God, and then all of a sudden it happens, and so that's their aha moment and they're able to pinpoint it out on their timeline of their life. Whereas people who grew up in the church, I've known about Jesus for as long as I can remember. I've known about God for as long as I can
mm,
remember. I can't tell you the exact moment, maybe, when I became a Christian, but it's all kind of, I don't want to say necessarily it's irrelevant, but it kind of is because anyway, like we put it on a timeline, but time is irrelevant to God. Time is just an
Mm,
object for God. God doesn't look at you, oh, you're saved at that moment. You know, he knew before the beginning of the foundation of the earth. He created you. He knew who his chosen were, right? So, you know, he just we see it through time lens where it looks like, oh, I became a Christian at this moment. But
mm,
you know, God sees time as just one giant object, whereas he doesn't see like that one moment. He sees your whole life as this guy's a Christian, this guy's my child, this guy's saved, you know, not just, oh,
mm,
he's my child from this moment on, you know. So I think when I switched my mindset to that and you know, more of that, and that's a biblical mindset, um, you know, it became easier to go through all of that stuff and just dissect all of that stuff.
mm.
But
Yeah.
to answer your question, I wouldn't say no, I didn't have one major like aha moment, but a series of moments in my life. And quite frankly, a lot of them have happened just you know, within these last 3 or 4 years. So,
Mm,
um, yeah, yeah, you never know what
yeah.
God is has in store for you.
It's so important to say out loud too, because a lot of people, like you were saying, they're typically embarrassed of like, yeah, I don't have that moment, or like the
Yeah.
Damascus Road is normally the
Yeah,
analogy people give.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like, yeah,
Yeah.
I I didn't have a big thing that's like burned into my brain. Just like you, like, yeah, I can think of a
Hmm.
couple different parts of my life where different things made more
Yeah.
sense, and like even like the gospel really
Hmm.
didn't become very real to me until the last couple of years, just
Hmm.
like you were saying too. So with
Yeah.
the gospel be having more of a deeper understanding to you, how have you seen the gospel transform your life in just the past few months or maybe the past few years? Like how did it
Hmm.
transform your job, your perspective, maybe the relationships that you
Hmm.
carry
Oh, that's a good question. Kind of like what you said, it definitely became more real. And I know that's kind of a a vague answer, but I guess to dissect that a little bit, I would say my love for it became more real. When you realize how complete it is and how it really like just how you don't contribute anything and God doesn't require you to contribute. We
out?
often get caught up and we think the gospel is a message about what we can do for Christ. But when we switch that up and we have that mindset of the gospel is a message of what Christ has done for us, it's so much easier to worship. It's so much easier to be thankful
Mm,
when you take our flesh and us completely out of the picture, completely out of the equation. What I mean by that is when I'm stressed out about thinking I have to do more things to God, for God, or I'm not living my life perfectly, or I need to be better. The focus isn't on the spirit. The focus, even in that, the focus is on the flesh. And
mm,
we make the gospel about us, not about Christ. But when we switch our view to Christ, that's where everything changes. And I think for me, the gospel, like I said earlier, how it's become more real is I used to view the gospel as, if I'm being honest with myself, as a pillar in my Christian life.
mm,
Um, you know, okay, yep, you have the gospel, you believe the gospel, you can check that box off. That's one pillar, but now you have to check off the obedience pillar, the righteousness pillar, the good works pillar. And it's just really stressful, to be honest with you. It's a
it's
pain.
not doable. Yeah.
It's yeah, you put this huge burden on yourself, and Christianity. I want to be clear on this. Christianity is all about getting rid of those burdens, not adding more burdens on. God doesn't say, "Come to me, and I will give you more burdens," right? He
Mm,
doesn't say that,
mm-hmm.
and that's what it kind of felt like, you know, the gospel for me for a long time, and that was just because I was only making it a pillar in my life. But when you make it, like I said, grace in the gospel has to be the whole foundation. It has to be the beginning and the end of your salvation. It can't just be the beginning of your salvation. Paul says that even to
Mm,
the church in Galatians. He says, "Are you guys so foolish? You've started in the spirit. Are you being perfected by the flesh?" But
mm.
I think we get so caught up in, okay, we've been saved. We have salvation. We have this grace. Now we have to perfect our flesh. And That's not the gospel. The gospel is that that's already been taken care of. That's already been done for you. Now you can live your life in freedom. Now you can live your life, just not tied down to your past. He sets the prisoners free, right? So I think it's just become more real in that aspect. And when you're excited about that, you have a passion for that, when you're like, oh my goodness, like this is good news. Because at first, growing up, probably for me, the good news wasn't all that good. And what I mean by that is, okay, you think, you have the main part, like, oh, I've been saved, that's good news. But then it's like, oh, you have to maintain that, or you have to contribute to your sanctification. You have to make yourself more righteous. That's not good news, because that's a big burden, and quite frankly, it's impossible for us, right? So
It's exhausting. Yeah.
yeah, it's not a message of rest. It's not a message of, take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light, and my ways are easy. It's the complete opposite. And so when the good news actually became purely, really just good news for me, without any of that, what I was tying to it, thinking it was the gospel, but it wasn't, that salvation by works, or that adding, I have to contribute something. When I unhitched that from that, then the gospel becomes literal, the greatest news of your life. And
Mm.
you just, like, I've had like this passion here recently, these last couple of years, of just, that's the message that I want to spread too. Not a false gospel that says I have to add something or contribute something, or even, I feel like my big battle right now is legalism in the church. That's where my conviction and my heart is, to do battle in. And when that you get that good news, you just want to proclaim it, and it's
Mm.
not, and here's the thing too, it's not a burden to proclaim it.
It
If
shouldn't
it's a
be.
if it's a burden, then you're probably doing something wrong. Like something's not,
Mm.
not right. Uh, but I used to think that I had to burden myself. Like I had to go up there and do something I really didn't want to do. I had to add this weight to myself. But realistically, when I got the pure good news, it made me want to proclaim it. And so it's
Mm.
not a burden to go up there and preach. It's not a burden to be a youth leader. It's something that I want to do. I enjoy doing it. It's not a burden. Sometimes you get worn out, you get tired, but I would never call it a burden. It's something that I enjoy, it's something that I love, and that's
Mm.
where my desire is, and that's what the gospel does. It creates that desire in you, um, to, you know, to do what God has called you to do. Um, and so yeah, I think that's just a big thing to remember too.
Oh yeah. No, you really made the most natural transition into my next question of just like,
Yeah.
because you've had that life change, do you see yourself disciple making? Do you see yourself being a
Yeah.
guide?
Yeah. Um, yeah. A quick story that kind of would, answer that. Like,
Please.
you remember, so I remember talking to you a little bit about this, a few years ago, when I was really struggling with baptism. My baptism, was it legitimate? Was it real? I thought my church has a tradition where, usually you go up in front of everybody and, uh, like, say, oh, I got baptized, And I was when I got baptized, I was really shy, not very outgoing. I asked if I didn't have to do that. And yeah, they said that's fine. So I was baptized with, my family around me, but I never went
Mm.
up to the church, and I made a big and make a big announcement about it. And so in my, as I got older, that started to bother me a little bit, where I was like, I felt burdened, like I had to go up and make like this huge announcement. And it made me worry, and made me fear, it made me question my salvation. It made me wonder if my faith was real, was it legitimate? I thought God thought I was a coward. Um, Funny thing is, though, now now I go up there and I preach, and that's my desire to do that. And so I think it's funny how that was such a big burden, and I thought that was
Mm.
something that I had to do, like I had to whip myself into doing. I had to suffer that, and even though it was going to be hard for me, I had to suffer through that and go up there and prove to God that I had faith, or
Mm.
that, like, I had that I was not ashamed and stuff like that. Like I had to, um, like almost like acknowledge God before, and taking scripture out of context, I felt like I had to acknowledge this was oh, you have to acknowledge God before men or he's not going to acknowledge you.
Mm.
But the funny thing is, I wrestled with that for so long, but now I'm going up there preaching, and I'm preaching in August on the 25th at NLCC. This will be my second time at NLCC, and I love doing it. I have a desire
Mm.
and a will to do it. It's not a burden. And so I just think that's funny. I was putting all of these restrictions on myself, all of these like I Michelle, my girlfriend, she'll tell you this too. I love having this conversation. Like just I was thinking that God was putting up barriers to our relationship, but it's not God putting up the barriers in our relationship. The only one putting up barriers is me. And so I was putting up all of these barriers in my relationship to God and all these conditions that I had to meet um, in order to be right with God when
Mm.
that was me putting up those conditions. That wasn't God. And I think it's just funny now looking back at it. Now I'm just going up there like it's second nature. Like I just with no hesitation and just but I have that desire and that will to do that. And I just think that's really something really awesome that God has done in my life. Because it's just weird too. Like at church, I was known to be this quiet, shy guy who, was a Christian and sat in the corner, but didn't really serve much or get involved. But
Mm.
now like, and this isn't because of me, and I know that sounds cliche. Everybody says that, but I'm being serious here. Like, if it relied just on me, nobody I would never be asked to preach. Like, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, but yeah, but now I'm up there preaching, and I've been a youth leader now for 3 or 4 years, um, and just I've had a bigger voice this year in the youth program, and yeah, it's just I think it's funny because like I've grown up with some of these, a lot of everybody at that church, and like I'm sure it's strange for them to see this quiet kid who used to not say anything now be this person who's going up, sometimes on Sundays and preaching. And I just think
Mm.
that's a beautiful gift from God. That's grace and mercy too, because I know I like this sounds cliche too. I know I don't deserve it, but that's true.
Mm. That's so cool. Well, kind of taking like a snapshot of your overall story up until this point, if you could have a movie made about your life, what would the title of it be?
Oh, that's a without putting just coming up with something on the spot. I probably have to say something like Twister or something like that because it's felt like a Twister, and it's definitely a lot of ups and a lot of downs, um, but yeah, there's a lot of moments in between that there's a lot of storms, but you know how they say like in a tornado, the eye of the storm is completely peaceful and completely calm.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of peace and a lot of calm along with the craziness.
Mm.
Um, But this isn't a paid advertisement for the new Twister movie coming out or
No,
anything
not
like
one
that.
bit. No, no plagiarism.
Okay. But no, that's just going something just off the top of my head, like just on the spot. I would say something like that because life is definitely a roller coaster, and I think people expect it to be a diagonal line up. That's what my life should be, and that's
Mm.
not the case at all. It's all over the place. Yeah,
Hops
yeah.
off the page, gets off the floor, and it's
It,
everywhere. Yeah.
Exactly. And you just never know where, you're going to end up either, where life's going to, these last few years have been just some of the best and some of the worst. And it's just weird looking back at it. I just a lot of blessing with the preaching and
Mm.
the opportunities to preach and the growing in the faith. A lot of hard moments with just the struggling with insecurities and the lies of the enemy, and then also, losing my mom, which was, something that you don't expect. Um,
Mm.
but also just, and then also, Michelle, my girlfriend, has just been another huge blessing from God too. Something that I don't deserve. Like I all the sin that I have in my past and mistakes. Like I truly do not deserve Michelle and my relationship with her, and just that's just another story of God's grace. And when you see those moments of God's grace in your life,
Mm,
like it just, it does. And we're not as thankful as we should be, but it does, it makes us at least stop and reflect and think.
mm, that's true. So, what would you say to someone who was scared or intimidated in sharing their story? How would you encourage them?
That's okay for starters. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be intimidated. Um, I just give it to God, really. That's all I can say. Um, and also, just, you're God never has a gun pointed to your head saying you have to do something. You know, and I think we put a lot of added pressure on ourselves, where we think God has this gun pointed to the back of our head saying, if you don't do this, then
Mm,
get out of my sight, kind of thing. But there's, in due time, just patience, really. God's timing, we don't understand it. It seems we can get frustrated, um, but eventually, somebody's gonna, your story is gonna be used for God's purpose and God's kingdom, and He'll give you the
mm,
will and the desire to do that when the time is right.
mm-hmm,
Um, I think I think it's in Philippians. Paul says, it's God who not only gives us the will, but also the desire to do of His good pleasure. And we think that we have to muster up that will and that desire. No, um, that's one of the hard lessons that I've had to learn in my life. That's God that musters that up. So in His timing, uh, I'm sure, like, if somebody's, their story will be used for great things. But ultimately, our story is just a magnifying glass of the greatest story of all time, and that is obviously the
mm,
gospel of Jesus Christ. So even just proclaiming that, even if you don't have a story, even if you don't think you can always proclaim the gospel story, and that's going to be more effective, anyways. But
mm,
um, but no, stories and testimonies, though, I used to think they were silly, but people get a lot from them, and they're definitely important. But like I said, God will give you the will and the desire to share your testimony with the right people and
mm.
the right time. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, I technically only have one last question, and it's typically just the invitation of, is there anything else you sense the Holy Spirit wants you to share for the sake of anybody else who would hear this podcast?
Um, Really, just I would say, kind of like I said earlier, grace is not just a pillar, you guys. It's the whole foundation. I know I've
Mm,
seen a lot of people question their salvation and think to themselves, well, how can I be a Christian and struggle with sin? How can I be a Christian and struggle with pornography or sexual sin or alcohol or drugs? How can I be a Christian and still do these things and struggle with these things and fall to these things so easily? Um, but remember, you have nothing to do with your salvation. It's all grace, and the Bible's very clear. Paul says to the centurion, when the centurion asked him basically point blank, what do I have to do to be saved? He thinks he has to do something. Everybody thinks they have to do something to be saved. But realistically, Paul doesn't give him something to do. He just says, believe in Jesus Christ and you and your household will be saved. So it's easy to get caught up in the world because the world's all about doing. Look at
mm,
Nike's logo, just do it. It's not about doing, you guys. It's about receiving in the gospel. So I think just if you slow down and you focus on what you've received and what you've been given by God, life just becomes a lot more joyful, a lot more happy, and a lot more
mm,
peaceful. And that's where God wants us to do. Wants us to do. He wants us to rest in what's already been done. So I guess if my life, at the end of my life too, if like that's what somebody says, I hope it's not about look at all the things that Jacob has done. I think it's like, wow, that dirty sinner was saved by Jesus Christ, you know, even though he still made mistakes, he still messed things up all the time, you know, just that God's grace would be glorified about how sufficient that it is and how amazing that it is. I think that's what our goal should be. That should be the story, not what we've done. So, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Absolutely true. You nailed it. Thank you for saying that. Greatly
Yeah.
appreciate it. Well,
Well,
I typically end these podcasts with a high five.
uh-huh.
So I know we're through a screen, but if you
Uh-huh.
would do your best to pick a number between 1 and 10, we'll count down from there. High five the screen or the camera, whatever you want to do,
Okay. Okay.
and we'll go from there.
Okay, seven seems like a holy number, right? Like 7?
7 is a complete number, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, number of completeness. So let's do
Yeah.
7 is, and
Okay.
so I want to say thank you too for just giving me a platform to be able to share. Like I think it's awesome what you're doing, and yeah, I think it's just it's a cool podcast. So I thank you.
Thank you very much. It wasn't my idea, but I'll just point back to God in it and just
There you
hopefully
go.
keep that up.
There you go. Well, yeah, I guess we'll count down to 7, right?
All right. I'm ready when you are.
All right, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Here we go. 7,
7,
6.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's Infinite Story. If it resonated with you, send it to someone you think would be blessed by it. If you would like to share your story, please reach out to us at infiniteideas.studio. You never know how far the impact of your story can reach. Take care now.